a health worker and PLP member on the West Coast who organizes around the health consequences of racism and incarceration, as well as working with families impacted by police violence. John is a member of PLP and educator in Chicago who's involved in struggles against police terror and evictions. Tanya Golash-Botza is a sociology professor and author of several books on racism and immigration policy. Elle, a social service advocate and activist for many years. She's a member of PLP and believes that defeating racism and sexism in all forms hinges on smashing capitalism in our society and the world. So I'm going to make a few remarks and then call on our panelists to answer some questions at length. The last year has exposed the inability of capitalism to provide for the health and well-being of workers, from the unemployed to the professional, causing mass death, hunger, unemployment, homelessness, detentions, deportations, and severe mistreatment of immigrants, and unprecedented fires and storms resulting from climate change. Moreover, all of these calamities have fallen much more heavily on Black and Latin workers, exposing once again the extreme racism of US capitalism. Of great immediacy to all of us as health workers has been the COVID-19 pandemic, which has killed over 220,000 in the United States and over 1.1 million workers worldwide. This pandemic and many others in recent decades are no accident, but a predictable result of capitalist practices that are accelerating. The infringement of mining, industrialization in agriculture and animal husbandry, and the masses of the urban poor being pushed into previously forested areas have brought mankind into touch with many viruses which were previously isolated in forests and wild animals. The lack of healthcare and the imperative to keep workers at work no matter the danger also raises the racist human toll of emerging diseases. The other disasters of fires and storms also stem from capitalist need to maximize profit and think only in the short term of the next quarter's earnings. Even more frightening is the relative decline for the last several decades of the United States in relation to China with regards to production and to economic and political influence in Asia, Africa, and South America, which makes inter-imperialist war very likely in the future. That is why we strive to build an international revolutionary party, which our panelists will now discuss in more depth. So I'm going to ask them a few questions. Can United States capitalism exist without racism? Can capitalism be reformed? And does voting for Democrats or liberals mean we won't have more epidemics or fascism or war?
All right, good morning, good afternoon, folks. Yeah, I mean, I think that's a question that sort of kind of gets to the heart of what we're trying to do. I mean, I think, you know, one way to, especially now, sort of in this period of uprisings, you know, just yesterday, right, in Philadelphia over the last couple of days, we're seeing these uprisings from George Floyd onward, which is really inspiring. And so this question now is super important. You know, one way I try to think about it is, has racism or capitalism ever existed sort of independent of each other? And I think the answer is no, right? From Marx to, you know, Black Marxists like, you know, Robin D.G. Kelley, Ruth Gilmore Wilson, even sort of more kind of popular thinkers like Kendi, right? Kendi, you know, Ibram X. Kendi calls them the conjoined twins, right? And he says, you know, the life of capitalism and the life of racism cannot be separated, right? Well, then the question is, can the death of racism and the death of capitalism be separated, right? And he doesn't go into that too much, but I think that's how we have to sort of kind of think about these things, right? You have capitalism, which on the one hand has this sort of inherent drive for maximum profit, right? Competition is inherent with that. And then you have racism, which is like a three-legged stool, where on the one peg is sort of the arbitrary selection of one group, right? A socially constructed, you know, defined race, right? That's super exploited. And you have this ideology to sort of justify, inferiority and superiority of different groups. We have like anti-Black racism on the one hand and white supremacy sort of on the other extreme. And then the third is just all the various institutions, right? From education and healthcare to the media to the entire sort of state apparatus. It's a fabric of the world, but particularly this country, right? Where this racism is just sort of reproduced, and even involves people of color in these various, Black workers or Latin workers, Indigenous, however you want to describe them, right? Are even within these various institutions that perpetuate it, right? And so all of these sort of three sort of pillars just prop capitalism up. In the US, the way it sort of looks, you have where, like, for example, for employed workers, right, there's the racist wage differential, right, where maximum profits again sort of derived from paying Black workers the least, and that then drives down wages of white workers. For unemployed workers, you have this massive reserve army of unemployed, and we see this even more so, right, during this pandemic, right, this massive reserve army of the undocumented workers. You see how racism sort of plays into it. And what you see is Indigenous workers actually being the most sort of unemployed versus Black workers, next is Black workers and then Asian and white. You see this sort of like these reserve army of unemployed that then again drives down wages. And we see that play, and we see how racism plays into that, right? And then, we see all other sectors, right? Whether just massive segregation. So you think about the healthcare, the quality of schools, the quality of hospitals and medical clinics, or the absence of any of these services, right? All of those things that are unequal throughout society is another way to sort of extract profit, right? And massive amounts of profit again just to show how these two things are sort of separate. You can't separate them. So I think, again, we see sort of just racism driving down the wages and living conditions of all workers, including white workers, right? And that there's very little material gain other than just given racism, right? Given anti-immigrant racism. We see this playing out with all the various sort of, poor Trump supporters, right? And so again, I think it speaks to why multiracial unity is essential. And as public health workers, I see it every day at my clinic. I see how racism plays out in checking cholesterol levels and blood pressure. And, I work in HIV in particular. And so we see again how racism just impacts us at the cellular level, how capitalism impacts us at the cellular level. So again, I think as healthcare workers, as public health workers in this conference, we have to start talking and doing and building more specifically around anti-capitalism, more specifically.
Thank you, Felipe. John, did you have some comments you wanted to make?
Yeah, I think I'll take your second question. Thinking about, can capitalism reform itself? Because I think, this year, 2020, has really brought us face to face with that question, right? I know we're having that discussion with a lot of folks. And so I think when we think about this question, we have to understand that the main purpose of capitalism is to maximize profit, right? They make profit off of our labor, and they had to create a social and political ideology accompanied with rules to justify and enforce that. So we have to also, understand that just like reforms are given, they can and will also be taken away. So in the 1930s, when the United States of America had its largest communist movement and its largest membership of communists, the United States government reformed itself, right? And it passed the New Deal, a New Deal that did grant, some benefits to workers. It did soften some of capitalism's destructiveness with programs like Medicare and Social Security. And it did pull some workers out of unemployment. However, in 2020, we find ourselves again in a massive economic crisis. And then also in 1960s, we saw the U.S. government reform itself again, right? When it gave I'll put that in quotes, it gave Black workers the right to vote, and it got rid of overt Jim Crow laws and housing discrimination. Although we know in retrospect that institutionalized racism never left. It got better, it got stronger, and it became more clandestine. Reformist demands often operate to transform systems that are facing resistance. But it reforms things just enough to stabilize a system and to preserve the status quo. So surely there are moments in which reforms provide what I hear a lot of people call harm reduction, right? But it provides this harm reduction in a more immediate sense, like an eviction moratorium. But harm reduction does not equate to liberation. It does not lead to the end of exploitation. So getting a moratorium on evictions or defunding the police are definitely struggles that we as workers should be involved in, but we have to understand that harm reduction is not going to liberate us and is not going to liberate the working class, right? But then, also as we see right now, as the U.S. is as the U.S.'s position as top imperialist in the world is declining, we see the bosses are less able to give us a new deal, right? Or a great society type reforms that they did in the past. This year, we've seen thousands of workers rise up and in some cases loot because the bosses could not, and would not provide for folks during this pandemic, right? And these rebellions, yes, they were kicked off by police terror, but we know that these rebellions were because workers felt like they had to take their destiny in their own hands and do what they had to do to survive. So I think this shows the U.S.'s decline as a world power, but also its inability to reform itself.
Thank
I mean,
you.
if I could jump in real quick, I think just thinking about the New Deal, these reforms, right? The New Deal, how that left Black workers out, right? How, workers coming back from World War II, right? Who got the GI Bill, how that left Black workers out, right? Thinking about how, Lincoln, quote, freed the slaves, but then, couldn't provide any sort of, any land, any just sort of 40 acres and a mule, but could provide the Homestead Act for white workers, right? And so all
purposefully,
purposefully,
I think is yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think, again, when we look at these reforms, think about how these reforms play out, in a very racist way. And thinking about what was the response to the civil rights movement, and you get war on crime and war on drugs, right, as a way to sort of take back those gains, right, and lead to mass incarceration. And you have, the Biden-Harris ticket, where like these architects, right? I think maybe we'll talk about some of that later, but the architects of mass incarceration. Biden was a segregationist, anti-busing, wrote some of these crime bills. He's the author of them. That's I work in HIV, and we see that the health impact of mass incarceration. For decades, and these are the champions. They're supposed to be our champions that we're supposed to be voting for. It's a joke, really. So I didn't mean to cut you off, Elle. I think you were going to say something.
Maybe Tanya would like to give us more of an international perspective.
Yeah, sure. Good morning, good afternoon. I'll talk a little bit about immigration and its relationship to global capitalism, because even though some forms of comprehensive immigration reform might be on the agenda, none of these reforms address the fundamental underlying problem of global capitalism. So global capitalism is dependent on the existence and enforcement of borders. So the primary way capitalists make profit is by extracting surplus value from their employees. So any value employees produce beyond their wages goes to the capitalists. So it's in the interest of capitalists to keep wages low. And then internationally, countries can be divided pretty much between the high income countries of the global north, like Australia, and the low income countries of the global south, like Bangladesh. So local labor markets vary tremendously in terms of wages. The minimum wage in Australia, for example, is about $28,000 a year, compared to $200 a year in Bangladesh. So capitalists have moved the production of goods from high income countries in the global north to low income countries in the global south, where they can pay workers lower wages and thereby earn more profits. So capitalists worldwide benefit from the existence of borders because they can produce goods at a low cost in the global south and then sell them for a high profit in the global north. Employers in the global south are able to pay their workers in those countries a low wage because it's difficult for most workers to leave their countries of birth in an attempt to earn higher wages. So there are billions of people in the world working and living in extreme poverty. So for many of those people, migration to a higher income country seems like an avenue out of extreme poverty. And it's true, sometimes migration can be an individual solution to poverty, but it does little to alleviate the underlying root cause of poverty and of migration, which is global capitalism. So long as global inequality exists, you're going to see international migration as a solution by some people to their poverty. So that means that people are going to cross borders, often at great peril to their lives and limbs. Every day, thousands of residents of the global South make the difficult decision to leave their countries of birth in search of a better life. So there's many reasons for migration: war, insecurity, violence, and family reunification. Nevertheless, we would see far less international migration if it weren't for global inequality. So when capitalists outsource the production of goods to countries in the global South, they bring those workers more firmly into the global capitalist economy. So these linkages that are created translate into increased migration flows. Now, capitalists are able to negotiate with several countries to determine where they're going to build their factories, but workers don't have the ability to negotiate their wages across borders. And when workers from the global South do attempt to migrate, they encounter significant barriers. And these borders basically, prevent most, but importantly, not all workers from moving across borders. Those workers who do move across borders, they don't have access to the full suite of rights that citizens of the destination country have. And this lack of rights makes them vulnerable to exploitation. Their exploitability, vulnerability, and deportability are beneficial to employers who can pay them lower wages and oblige them to work harder and faster. So leaders around the world profess an interest in developing the countries of the global South and pulling them out of poverty. But the reality is that the powerful countries of the global North have a strong vested interest in maintaining this inequality between the North and the South. And countries in the global North control the resources and military power that can and do preserve this inequality. So long as there is global inequality, there will be international migration. So long as countries in the global North benefit from the unequal distribution of resources around the globe, these countries will continue to build walls, fences, and cages to preserve their position in the global order. So long as there's global capitalism, there will be precarity, poverty, deprivation, and global inequality. We have to open the borders and dismantle capitalism to achieve global justice.
Thank you, Tanya. Even though you may have many questions about what we've said already, we're going to go on to the next segment and discuss things more later. So I'd like to ask Elle to describe what kind of society we envision when we talk about communism, and also consider if we need a violent revolution in order to get there.
That's my buzzer. I have no idea who's ringing it. I won't be checking today. It'll be all right. They'll be okay. Hey everybody, thank you so much for joining. There's so many people here. I think that's awesome. I am Elle, and I'm a member of Progressive Labor Party, and I'm talking to you a little bit about what that means and a few other things that go along with that. First, we are a revolutionary communist party. We don't believe that these very needed and important life-saving changes that have to happen in society, that people are talking about in the streets, that people are talking about in groups as big as this or groups, smaller of friends and families, any of that. We don't think that any of this will happen under capitalism, naturally or otherwise, right? And it's interesting because I just had a conversation with an acquaintance, and we were kind of going back and forth, and it dawned on me that this acquaintance was trying to talk about how a word can't be so important that we think things can't change. And the word she's talking about is capitalism. So it put me in the mindset of this conversation that we're having today, that we're talking about more than just a word. A lot of people, do understand it in that marginal sense. But we're not just talking about a word, right? We're talking about a ruling class and the system that was created a long time ago, the tradition of which is still upheld, knowing that tradition is at the very lives of the people who are relied upon to do the work. So we've come to understand in our party that a violent communist revolution against the system of capitalism, preferably led by Progressive Labor Party, that's what we're working to do, has to happen, right? This means that there has to be a destruction of an elitist-centered society, capitalist society, worldwide, not just in one place or another place. It has to happen worldwide. That's the goal, right? We know it's going to spark off one place or another, but the goal is for this to happen everywhere we are, because right now, under the system of capitalism, we're all suffering. I mean, internationally, we see the ramifications of it. This revolution has to be defended. It has to be enforced by the working class. So when we talk about a violent revolution, it isn't that, we're ready to go, we're ready to fight, we're ready to get it, we're ready to be in this never-ending conflict. It's the reality of what's happening. What's happening now under capitalism is violent. What's happening right now, right? In Chicago, in LA, in all of these places, in Minneapolis, all of these places that we've seen, in Ferguson still, we see that violence is happening right now. So we're under no delusions that more violence is going to happen as we come forward and say no, as a class of workers, as we come forward and say no, we won't allow this. And it's the principles of Marxist-Leninist communism that's influenced by Mao, influenced by Du Bois, influenced by Claudia Jones, and many more revolutionary theorists who talk about being reflective as well as critical about what we agree to do and about what we want to build. So what does communism look like? What does it look like? What does it mean? It means supporting workers that fall under attack, no matter what, no matter where they are, wherever we can. It means that under the system we're in, we know that working class people must rely on each other to survive. We know that this has to be done to counter the rules of the capitalist system, right? It has to be done to counter what we've been forced to be used to. And in many cases, workers are going to be punished for it. We're punished for it now, right? And it's the collectivity that we learn now under this system that's going to get us through, that's going to make us support each other. Under communism, this worker collectivity and this solidarity is going to be the basis for our lives. The way that we have to live now, as we support each other, as we support our family members, as we support our neighbors, as we support our close friends, we don't have to do it in secret under communism. Under communism, that is going to be the system. Worker-controlled society, because workers know how to do it. Right now, we don't benefit from what we know how to do. Under communism, we're saying that, of course, we will. We will be the ones who are creating this society because we know how it'll work, right? And the way that we get this message out, other than this wonderful conference that's been happening, we build relationships with people. That doesn't stop either, right? It's building relationships with other workers. That's why, we make it a point to be in mass organizations, right? Not from an opportunistic point of view. This is what we do. We fight anyway, right? But we are meeting people. We're growing relationships with other workers. That's what we're doing. And we believe that our road to this revolution that has to happen, change isn't going to happen any other way. Our road to that revolution is in building these real relationships with other people, being in positions to point out inconsistencies of what doesn't work under the capitalist system. And our fellow working class siblings are already doing that. We all know what doesn't work. We all look at these debates that have happened. I mean, they've been jokes. The joke is on the working class, of course, but they've been ridiculous, right? In terms of what they talk about and what they prioritize, and even having to take responsibility for the damage they've done. We point out those inconsistencies. We're not afraid to do that. We're not afraid to push our line. At a certain point, we can't be afraid to say who we are and what we fight for. We learn to use the weapons that have been formed to be used against us, we learn how to take those and turn them back around, right? We're in these organizations against racism, against sexism, classism, ableism, against capitalist oppression, and we make them revolutionary. Well, we build relationships with people to make the people revolutionary. The organizations are going to come and go. That's the reality. We're trying to build relationships with people to grow a party. And building a mass party is not shying away from talking about who we are as a communist party, which is why we're having this event today, and why that's such a threat to the ruling class. We all have heard horrible things about communism before we actually joined this party, right? It was something to be feared, right? It was like a boogeyman. Oh, you're a communist, right? And we had no idea what that meant. But the issue is we didn't even try to find out what that meant. And that's the plan. Because once we do find out what it means, we see the sensicalness of it. We see that what the ideology of communism is at its bare bones is the kind of society that we know we can thrive under. It's not socialism. And what the ruling class does is they conflate those two things a lot. It's not socialism. It's not these failed attempts that have happened before. Progressive Labor Party realizes that we have to take what was tried, the lessons we've learned since then, improve upon them. Workers together struggling to improve upon these things to create a better society that works. And again, the reality of this violent revolution is what's missing from the popular conversation about these things. We can't shy away from that. There's no way we can. We're living it. We're living in a violent reality for working class people. And we're not even trying to make actively a revolution yet. We're just trying to live and survive, right? And under our line, we know that the Black working class is a key force in creating revolution. And in the small ways that Black workers are trying to just push back to gain some humanity, we can see what the ruling class is willing to do. We can see it. And we see all of the lengths that capitalists are willing to go through to retain power and to retain control over us. It's deadly. It's absolutely deadly. So all of the conversations that are happening now about how to achieve things like abolition in schools, abolition in our jobs, abolition in our social networks. We believe that true abolition is not going to come until we smash this system. We can call this system anything we want to call it. We know it is capitalism, and we know what that means. We know that the principles of capitalism is anti-working class. We know that. We know that. And so when we talk about communism, we have to know that what we're talking about is something to emancipate workers, something that workers are in charge of, something that workers are at the center of. And to make that happen, we have to smash what's around us now in order to strengthen ourselves. About that more with any questions or anything else.
Thank you so much, Maria. I'm now going to ask all the panelists to engage in the discussion of how we work in the present, because the revolution is not around the corner. So how do we build class struggle and class consciousness now? And how do we fight racism and build multiracial unity, amongst other questions? So please, all of you, let us know what you're doing and how you organize.
This is an awkward moment where everybody's looking at each other, right? Who's gonna go first? Yeah, I mean, I think the best advice or something like that I could say is when you see a good fight, you got to get in it, right? When you see workers, like we saw this summer, this massive uprising that we saw just really has transformed the world. That now there's a big movement in Nigeria. Now there's other movements going on in Africa, right? I think we have to get involved in these different struggles. We have to get involved in different mutual aid efforts, right? I mean, we have to view all these things as schools for communism, right? Like I was saying earlier, in the midst of this pandemic, it was not like the bosses or the capitalists who responded. It was working class people who responded with different mutual aid efforts to take care of us, right? One of the comrades the comrade who just spoke always said, "We got us," right? And so I think, you know, that's part of it. I think, so for me, what my work looks like is right now, and I think all of us, like, it changes, right? So right now, a big focus is just tenant organizing. I think that, you know, living on the south side of Chicago and the south side of Chicago being the headquarters of evictions in the city, and not really having a lot of eviction, not having a real big like tenant organizing apparatus, you know, I got involved in it. You know, some friends, you know, wanted to create something that could do that. And so, you know, I got involved in it. And within that have been, you know, pushing things, you know, as left as possible as I can, right? When we were first talking about an evictions committee, there was a lot of legality talk, right? So, oh, well, we have to make sure this is within the means and of legality and all of this stuff. And I said, look, when they start evicting folks, they're not going to be doing stuff legal. So we have to throw this, you know, we have to operate within the realms of legality out the window, right? If they're going to move folks out, we got to be there to move folks in, however that looks. So I think, you know, that's part of it. I think being involved in, like I said, these mutual aid efforts, as an educator, trying to, you know, push and nudge my students, you know, when possible, to get them involved, you know, because we have to be seen as fighters on our jobs, right? Like people on our jobs have to see us as fighters, as those who want to stand up and fight against racism. But we also have to be seen as anti-racist fighters in our communities. And so I think a good example of this would be, we had a comrade who just kind of heard about an eviction taking place kind of in passing. I guess somebody went live on Facebook and she showed up. And, you know, at first everybody was kind of passively watching as the police were gearing up to evict this person. And so our comrade just started yelling, like, "You're not moving them out," right? And so then all of the workers in that neighborhood said, "You know what? Yeah, you're not moving these people out," and ran the police off essentially, right? And then move those workers' things back into the house. So I think that's how our work has to look, given that bold leadership, and you know, putting this emphasis on organizing. Like, we have to be involved in class struggle, we have to be building relationships, and we have to be mobilizing and organizing folks.
Part of that, I think, too, is holding each other responsible as we're involved in these things. So I do a lot of work with folks with disabilities, right? Which have been, no matter what their disability level, some of the most marginalized people, regardless of race. Social class probably makes the biggest difference, but not in terms of internally within families, because we've been taught to devalue people who don't, quote unquote, produce, all the way down to our family level. And these are some of the most revolutionary folks that I've ever had the pleasure of dealing with, because they, you know, as a person with, you know, multiple disabilities myself, you fight. That's how you come into this world. You fight. You have to fight for everything. You have to fight to be considered a person that has an opinion. You always fight. You stay fighting, right? And if that's not the experience of the working class in a nutshell, I don't know what is, right? So we hold each other accountable in these movements. So not only are we joining these mass organizations, but, you know, and we welcome our fellow working class folks to hold us accountable to who and what we say we are. And we hold each other accountable to that. And we learn, and we're not afraid to correct things that don't work, right? That's huge. I mean, listening to these debates, just hearing these folks, especially Biden. I mean, these Democrats, you know, I swear, liberals are the main danger. That's the line of our party. And that's very real. Hearing him have the gall to apologize, you know, for the terror that he's just brought down on the working class. He apologizes for it, and then shows a picture of his Black running mate who's enacted some terror, right, herself on the West Coast. It's amazing. It's amazing. So when we talk about hold each other responsible, we hold them responsible, but we don't stop it at them. We don't stop it at these elites. We hold each other responsible. We make sure that we're doing what we say we're going to do. We make sure that we're carrying out our line. So that's an important discipline to have as well.
I think a few things. I think it's important to kind of contextualize too, like what kind of period we're entering. Lenin talked about the conditions, for revolution, right? And he talked about the ruling class being weak and unable to rule in the old way, right? And so you think about Trump versus Biden as representing actually two factions of the ruling class, right? And to the point where there's armed goons in the streets, right? So this sort of threat of civil war, right? And where Trump sort of represents this sort of overt kind of racism in your face, white supremacists sort of backed by domestic oil and maybe a couple of tech companies, whereas Biden kind of representing this like pro-imperialist world war, global racism, massive attack on the working class, right? And you see this fighting, and it's unclear how this is going to play out. We'll see what next week and the next few months looks like, in terms of whether there'll be a peaceful transition of power or whatever. But that's that we're entering that period, right? And then when the working class can't live in the same way, right? And what you guys have been talking about, these tenant out, the same thing is happening here, right? These uprisings around the police, people fighting against getting evicted, this fucking pandemic we're in. Workers are more and more fed up, and part of that is unfortunately being shifted into the elections, but that's temporary because Biden and Harris have to show their ass. If they win, they will show their ass. They will show who they are and who they represent, and that will expose. And what we do now in exposing them, while people may not in the short term be like, look, I hear you, but I'm going to go vote. Okay, that's fine. Just like it was under Obama when we started calling him before he was elected, right? People are like, oh, you can't talk about Obama. Now he's drone war, the porter in chief, and all these other things. So they start to expose themselves. And the third question is a communist party, a revolutionary communist party. And look, Progressive Liberal Party, we exist in 26 countries, right? And why us over any of the other parties? Folks are just going to have to kind of learn through practice. And I kind of think what John and I've been talking about, the same thing here is in the context of struggle, is gaining confidence in our class, right? I mean, an example was, November 19th last year, LAPD guns down in the newspapers an armed shirtless man, right? And we don't know his name. Some of our comrades go to the area where he was killed and kind of randomly stumble onto his girlfriend, who then connects us to the family. And then the family is working class, hates the police, and they're protest. This is before George Floyd, before any of the, the more mass uprisings. And so we get to know the family and we're fighting with the family. Now, what does justice look like for this family? And to me, that's one of the toughest conversations to have, is to kind of say, look, it's highly unlikely, right? Your son, your brother is one of 620 people that have been killed in the last 8 years, and not one stinking cop has been prosecuted, indicted, let alone prosecuted, right? And to say, justice will someday come when we have a revolution, right? It's a very hard conversation to have. You have to build trust and relationships over time. But just last week, we're in this police commission where his case is being discussed, and it's this disgusting display where they criminalize him, they justify his killing while the parents are talking, while the parents are the family is in tears. But we didn't set them up. We didn't say, hey, rah, justice, we're going to get justice from the system. No, and so now, the sister is a mass leader. She hasn't joined us yet, but is in a political study group. She talks about capitalism being the source, so I think, again, it's like, it's when folks, and we're small here, we're probably one of the smallest sort of collective, and yet we have with small forces with the right political line, we can have more of a mass expression, and we stand out. One of the other things I'm involved in is getting it's sort of the fund movement here, particularly organizing healthcare workers, and we've had two actions, right? Two mass actions. And both of them have happened after George Floyd, okay? So the first couple years was all very campaign driven, very, you know, call your supervisors and all of that, which is all important. And we had a sort of a reflection on that. And we talked about, look, we're not out in these streets. George Floyd, these mass uprisings are happening. We should be out there in these streets. We're not evaluating the work. We're not talking about, you know, we talk about capitalism, we talk about racial capitalism, but is there any kind of political education happening, right? And so through the work of being able to kind of push these things, so now we're having political education and we're now kind of in these streets. But again, it's limited, and there are a few people who are hopefully on this call who are involved in this work to really talk about, look, we can't say we're going to defund capitalism, right? We can address these like particular campaigns, but unless we're fighting for this overall bigger picture and winning people in the process, right, to sort of see. To be in the fight, like you said it's not opportunistic. We hate these cops, we hate these sheriffs, we don't want them in our hospitals, we want them out too. You know, we want to take away their money, sure, but that's not the solution. That's not, one, it's not going to happen. If it is, it's going to be, you know, by appearances mainly, and two, you know, this is the way folks are won, and how to get confidence in us is when we're in these struggles with them side by side, not kind of on the outside, kind of waving a red flag, but in that struggle with them. And so, I mean, there are numerous examples, but I think, again, being in this class struggle, what John was also talking about, and that tenant stuff, to me, is all about confidence that we can change society, right? And folks know it, right? In your schools, where you teach, where I work, the healthcare workers know we don't need these CEOs and CFOs and all this to run this facility. You know, we're the ones with the connections with our patients. We're the ones with connections with our students and wherever else we work. We know that, right? But confidence in our ability to run it, where does that come from, right? To me, that comes from being involved in these trenches and in these struggles, right? And I think that's really where ideas change and where people really get involved. And so folks on this call should be involved in these struggles with us, if you're not already.
I would just like to say that one of the mass organizations we've been involved in for many years is the American Public Health Association. And you're probably, most of you, aware of the last few years, a group of mostly young public health students and professionals put forward a resolution condemning police violence as a public health problem. And this, it's hard to believe now, but 4 or 5 years ago when this started, this was a matter of great horror to the leadership of the APHA, the liberals who did not want to offend police departments or the Democratic Party. And it took a 3-year battle of demonstrating, leafleting, fighting in the governing council until finally the resolution passed. And this year, the same or similar group was able to put forward a resolution about the evils of mass incarceration, which was widely accepted much more easily, based not only on the struggle in the organization, but of course what's going on in the world at large. But we've been involved for many years with resolutions against war in Southeast Asia, against fascism, against the massive drugging of children with psychiatric drugs, and other issues. And we've been involved in many sessions that we've presented and discussions in sections. So it's just an example of how you can work within mass organizations. So I would like to
we just have a little screen share issue, that's all.
Yes, somebody named it.
Yeah, maybe let the tech folks.
Yeah,
let the tech folks take care of it. We'll keep going.
While somebody's figuring out how to get rid of the shared screen, Cheryl, a friend, has been monitoring the chat for questions, and you can keep answering questions, asking questions in the chat. So Cheryl, go ahead.
Okay, hi. So first, Arash, I'd like you to like stop screen sharing. I think you accidentally clicked that button at the bottom of your own screen, so you can like unshare. That would be helpful. So in monitoring the chat, there were a couple, I mean, there's a lot of questions and comments, but I think there's two sort of main ones that stand out. And one is really about this people, I think given the period of time we're in, people really want to hear more about the alternative to voting and the Democratic Party. So there's multiple questions about what the alternative to Biden-Harris has to be more concrete. What can people do now to as an alternative to voting? And then also, there was a comment about the history of the Democrats. And so I think that would be like a good question to start with. And I've actually had this asked John the same question in the past. So I'm going to ask John to be the first one to take a stab at answering this. But other people, of course, feel free to chime in.
All right. So can you restate that question really quick?
So what do you think about what can people do now as an alternative to Biden-Harris? What do you tell your friends when they talk to you about how like we have to vote Trump out?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it is what the comrade Felipe was saying. I think that I don't know if we're going to always win those theoretical debates on, like right in this moment, right? I think that it's more so about, having those conversations that, and I saw one of the comments in the chat, but, I think illustrating what the Democrats have done up until this point and what other liberals have done up until this point, right? How, under Obama, it was like, under him is when we had Mike Brown and Trayvon Martin and these other cases, right? Under Obama is when we had 50 schools in Chicago being closed down, right? So I think, and his henchman, Rahm Emanuel, right, who was also a Democratic liberal. So I think it's, drawing on these examples of what the liberals have done. I mean, I think Biden and Harris's track record, I think speaks for itself. So, and I mean, I've been a part of conversations where folks are like, I know that he's a racist, sexist, rapist, warmonger, but he's not Trump, right? I've been a part of these conversations. So yeah. I don't know if I don't know how much you can ideologically push somebody who's at that point where they know that person is that, but still, making a decision to vote for him. But I think it's once this election resolves itself, right, however it's going to resolve itself, right, we're all saying it's going to be an interesting situation, but I think it's, when these liberals expose themselves, pointing that out. But then I also think it's about being involved in class struggle. I think coupling these theoretical discussions we have with people with also getting them involved in the struggle. That's how I was transformed, right? Before I was a communist and in the party, I was probably the biggest pacifist on the face of the earth, right? I was Dr. King all the way. And it probably wasn't much somebody could say to me to move me from that at that moment, right? But it was once I started going to protests and I started seeing the police beat up people who were very peaceful. That's when I was like, okay, well, what the party's saying might be right, because these folks are peaceful and they're still getting beat up, right? So maybe we can't take a peaceful approach with these folks. So yeah, I think it's about being involved in class struggle, but also I think as communists, we have to model that, right? We have to model what being a communist is. And I think that's very important. I had the opportunity to teach English in Africa for 1 year. And, when I was there, I was telling one of my friends there, I was like, I'm a communist. And, in places like Africa, that word isn't as like scary here, right? They hear those type of terms all the time. And so he asked me, are you a real one or a fake one? That was his response, right? To me.
That's a good response.
And, I'm with my chest out, I'm a real one, and, all this stuff. He said, okay. And so then maybe 5 or 6 months later, he brought it up again. He revisited that topic, right? He said, out the blue, I guess you're a real communist. right? So it was after those 5 months of me modeling, right? What being a communist is, right? Being an internationalist, and just interpersonally, looking out for people that were around me is when he said, I guess you are a real communist. So I think it's about modeling it and being involved in class struggle, but also having those theoretical discussions. I think the three of those things have to kind of happen simultaneously to win people from seeing the liberals as saviors.
I felt like Elle wanted to chime in there. I don't know if I'm wrong. I can move on. I hope that.
I always want to chime in. I talk a lot. There's never a time when I can't chime in. But yeah, no, it's absolutely true. I think in a lot of instances, being in mass organizations, but just being from a very working class area. Again, what's been on my mind is having this conversation with someone, and it became about words, right? It became about, well, do we have to call ourselves that? The word isn't what matters. And usually it's not just about the word. And I think I'm getting off maybe the point a little bit, but it's not about the word. There are things behind. It's not just the word capitalism. It's not the word I have a problem with, right? It's what it is. It's the essence of it. It's not the word communism that people even, and maybe people are responding to what the word has come to misrepresent by the ruling class. But, people do believe that they have a certain amount of privilege, even though they have none. It's the promise of maybe one day hitting the lottery and getting privilege that they're defending. It's just interesting when these conversations are fleshed out with people. In reading about the history of communism among Black populations in the South specifically has been so enlightening for me, and it's been the subject of some really interesting conversations. But just like the comrade said, I think a lot of times it's just just talking to people, trying to put yourself in a situation and being around folks and learning about it. Because I didn't learn anything about about communism from school. Right? That's not probably the place where you want to rely upon the information you get about a whole lot of stuff, including yourself. Right? So, I found out my great-grandfather tried to go to Garveyite meetings when he was young, and this is when police were on horseback back in the day. Police on horseback turned, these young Black people around, chasing them back into the state they came from. Because even these ideas were a threat. Right. So we know what they do and what they put out there about our party. I don't even think that was the point. I'm sorry. That's just sort of in the mind of.
Yeah, no, I think that all of this is helpful. And what I'm getting from you guys both is the sort of, it's an ongoing conversation with people, and it's being in the movement and doing the work that is really going to convince people. I've got you, Heidi, because that was my very next question for the panelists. The other thing that came up more than once in the chat was sort of the prior history of communism and how it's failed in other countries. Like one person wrote, "Sorry for being skeptical. Communism existed before. Things didn't work out. What's different now?" And someone else asked about having friends who had come, or family maybe who had been in prior so-called communist countries who are very anti-communist now. How can you talk to them? So I guess I was going to ask Felipe to start us off there, but of course, anyone else on the panel that wants to chime in would be useful. But Felipe, if you want to try to answer that question.
So there's for me, it's a funny story. There was, I know an Albanian family, and the grandfather had come to Chicago to visit. And so I said, "Hey, ask him what he thinks about Stalin." Just ask him. He goes, right? In Albanian, really, and he says in Albanian, the translation is, "I can't say one bad thing about Stalin," which was like, and then the mom, right, who's his daughter, is like, well, hang on. Well, there's some things we could say about Stalin. And she went to Engels Marx Lenin University, I believe, and in Albania. And then the daughter, so by generation, they were more and more anti-communist, right? The younger was the most anti-communist, so the grandfather was the least. And so I think that's just one thing, right? It's just sort of seeing, the further removed from the actual period in time, the more anti-communist one is. Those who lived it, particularly, in the 50s, say Albania broke, for example, with the Soviet Union in like 57 or 58, which was really in response to Khrushchev. So I think, one thing is just to say, look, the Soviet Union, was never communist, it was socialist and then became capitalist in the late 50s. And so for most of the experiences from the basically 1960 onward, and all the horrible examples one can give are really examples of capitalism, right? They're just capitalist manifestations in those particular countries. I mean, it was an imperialist country at the time. And then people can point to some of the benefits, like, in Albania up until I think the 90s, there was no such thing as a gas bill or electric bill or, utility bill, things like that. Although it also had problems. So I think, and so I've had conversations with people from those particular countries that call themselves communists that weren't. And, from my experience, if you actually talk to someone, they'll admit, okay, you're right, it wasn't communist, or, we did have money. Okay, I see that, and so you can kind of point out for those who honestly want to have a discussion about it that, okay, if communism means no money, right, no class, right, then was this that? No, it wasn't. So then what was it then? And let's call it what it was, right? So, but it's difficult. It's difficult, of course. I mean, now, all the, with the intensifying, rivalry with China, right? You read some of these and they're calling it a Stalinist, communist, Leninist, Marxist, right? They're calling all the names, right? That's what China is. And it's like this, imperialist, likely going to be a world war soon with China. And so we have that to grapple with, because I think, Elle was talking about names, right? What's in the name, right? And unfortunately, that for a lot of our class who haven't been really engaged in much class struggle over the last 40 years, are really removed from that class struggle, just like somebody who's a grandchild from Albania. They're removed from that understanding. And so that limited understanding, there's overlap between what they think China is now, what China was like in the 60s, which was doing some amazing things, particularly around health. I don't know. That'd be my response to that.
Okay, yeah, that was helpful. Does anyone else want to chime in? I'm sure you guys get this question all the time.
Yeah, just an accurate view of history. I think that in so many instances, we don't get that in our education because our education structure is capitalist. It goes to the benefits of elongating the capitalist system by capitalists. So we're not going to get the truthful picture, and we're not going to get the whole picture. So just like the comrade said, that so many people, as the person in the comments said, and a whole lot of people I've heard have this opinion. I've spoken to them with this opinion about, weren't these places communist? They didn't. That's just not the reality, right? The only people I learned about in history were Martin Luther King Jr. and Harriet Tubman, but not in the context of them doing anything to push back against the system they were in. I just learned their names and that they were Black, period. So you can't always rely on what this system has given in the way of information. And we know that people also talk about how the good things under capitalism, and how capitalism has had these programs and all of these things to try to right these wrongs. And it's survival, of course. These people who rule this society know that they have to give a little bit, but they snatch, I almost cuss, they snatch that stuff right back. They snatch it right back real quick. Within like 5-10 years, they snatch it back. And then people talk about the good old days and remember when we can afford bread. It happens that quick. So.
I read a very interesting book by John Scott, a young American welder who went to the Soviet Union in the 30s to participate in the massive industrialization project east of the Urals. And on the one hand, he wrote about the tens of thousands of young workers from previously impoverished or young peasants with no education who were trained in various industrial skills and were so inspired that they, moved forward a century in 10 years to industrialize and build farm and equipment for war in these factories. And they had education and they had literacy training, and he and they were tremendously inspired by the ideals of building a communist society. But on the other hand, he describes how things that we can now see as errors were creeping in, that there was like a 10-tier system of housing benefits and wage benefits, and that people were given in material incentives to advance. And so that this kind of mixed messaging, which, thinking that material incentives were still so important to people, was maybe one factor that led backwards instead of forwards. And on the other hand, what he saw was very inspiring to him and workers. So I think we have to learn lessons from the great advances as well as the mistakes that were made. And we can only try and make new mistakes because this system is going to lead to our demise. But we never read that kind of history.
I guess if I can add really quickly, I think it's about, I guess being able to put these certain things in context, right? I think a lot of times when we hear about, so one, I think when we're talking to people who are from previously socialist countries and are anti like communists and stuff, I think I've seen a lot of good, interesting memes and funny memes about, like, I think Cuba's a good example, right? A lot of the folks in Cuba who are there in Miami now were a part of the ruling class, right? when Fidel took power. So they may not, them and their descendants may not think too highly of communism, right? I think, what the comrade was saying earlier about like these countries, I think by definition, they weren't communists, right? A communist society, doesn't have class or money, and all of those systems did. And I think, pointing out those inconsistencies, I've been a part of discussions where people say, I don't want a communist society because it's not going to be any money. And then the next minute they'll say, everybody's going to get the same money, right? So I think we have to, kind of, when we hear these inconsistencies, really, I think, call them out and, really sharpen them. So.
Thanks, guys. I think that was like a pretty good coverage of different ways to approach that question when you're talking to people. I think a lot about how people say that communism or socialism didn't work. And I'm just like, but is capitalism working? I feel like, what is our definition of working right now? And I really like the message that, we have to learn from the things that were done well and also from the mistakes that were made so that we can do better in the future. Because this is what's happening now is definitely not working. So we're going to try to do something different. One of the other questions I wanted to bring up, and I thought maybe Tanya could start to answer this, but other people could chime in, is this stuff about white privilege and how to build a mass anti-racist movement. And that kind of things. I know Tanya had wrote an article I read many years ago about white privilege. So I don't know. I thought maybe we'd try and kind of address a little bit about this racism and how it's used currently. So Tanya, if you don't mind trying to answer that a little bit or speak to that.
Sure. First of all, multiracial anti-racist organizing is necessary, right? So because what we're up against, we're up against this whole system of global capitalism, and there's not like one, if we have disunity among us, like we're not going to be able to achieve the goal of dismantling it. So we definitely need a multiracial organization, and it has to be anti-racist from the start, right? So so within that organizing space, right, if you're in a multiracial organizing space, and if you're dealing with people who aren't accustomed to that, right? We live in a segregated society. So there's many people who don't really have experience working across racial barriers because they're segregated. And depending on where you are, even the potential for multiracial organizing might be limited because, it's segregated. So here in California, where I live, for example, 99% of the workers at the chicken factory are Latinx, right? So there's not a whole lot of space for multiracial organizing in segregated spaces. But to the extent that you are able to engage in multiracial organizing, I don't think that white privilege is a very useful analytic, because first of all, it's not a privilege to live in a racist society, right? At the same time, I do think it is important for everyone and for white people to be particularly aware of the extent to which maybe if you're white and you haven't been involved in anti-racist organizing before, there's probably some limitations to your understanding of how racism works, right? Because you haven't experienced it directly. You might, if you don't have close friends that experience it directly. So I think there's an importance in understanding your positionality and your relationship to the struggle. So there's a certain necessity for humility going into multiracial spaces if you don't have experience in those kinds of spaces. But the problem with white privilege and white allies is both of those terms ignore the fact that, it's not a privilege to live under capitalism. It's not a privilege to live under racism. It's not a privilege to live under patriarchy, right?
And I guess I would, and that's amazing. I've read some of what you wrote on that, and amazing. And I think that we're limited by words sometimes. I know that working around folks that I work around, a lot of times, even with the current era of the Black freedom movement. I mean, goodness, what. It's called by 1,000 different names, right? A Black liberation, right? That absolutely focuses on white privilege, right? Absolutely focuses on that. The conversation that I bring it around to is where the privilege lies for those that don't have institutional power. And that conversation often goes the same way. Well, of course, if you're poor and you don't have anything, you're shit out of luck anyway. But, there's still something to being white in society. And I think, and I think we just have to address that. That's something is the lies that elitists have told working class white people to bribe them into acting against their own interests. We have to just say that. I think we can't shy away from these conversations. We just have to say what it is. And we can point back in history to where that happened. Right? To people who were recruited to be slave catchers, to those who were recruited to deal extremely harshly with European immigrants who were trying to battle people taking advantage of their labor, right? These were workers that were given a little advantage because a little advantage is better than starving, right? So I think we have to just speak very honestly about these words like privilege and where it comes from and why it feels that way. Because like I said, every conversation I've had with people, we've gotten right down to the bare bones of it, and we've been in agreement. It's not a privilege living under this system. The treachery of the ones who are at the top of it, though, make it feels like if you got a can of beans, at least you're not starving. That's not the same as a privilege. So I think we just have to we have to have those conversations. They're not comfortable. They're going to turn into an argument. You might have to fight a little bit, but the conversations are necessary.
If I could chime in too, I mean, I think, like the absence of a particular attack is not necessarily a privilege. If I go into a store and nobody, follows me, well, okay, so you're treated normally. I mean, I don't know, is that, like how you should be treated, as opposed to like you go into a store and then they bring you free stuff or something, like you walk out without paying. Okay, maybe that's a privilege. But I think in general, it's just like the absence of something. And then really, when you think about some of the most overt ways that, say Black workers, Indigenous or Latin workers are attacked, white workers are attacked also, just to a lesser degree. I mean, you think about health disparities, and you look at, say, like the average white worker's health. I mean, that's not the bar. It shouldn't be. Like, let's at least be that healthy. Like, their health is terrible. Like Appalachia, hepatitis C and HIV outbreak. Also, like that's what we're shooting for. That's the privilege we all like. No, it's terrible.
Yeah.
Terrible. When you look at the suicide rates for young white men, right? Young white men. This is the most privileged, so-called privileged group in our society is young white males, and they're committing suicide at highest rates. And many of them are joining the military at record rates too. So they're more likely to die for U.S. imperialism. Like, I'm sorry, like that's not where I'm not, that's not my aspiration, you know, and it shouldn't be. And I think another aspect is, you know, when we talk about white supremacy, right, is thinking about that as a racist term. And what I mean by that is like, you know, as a racist stereotype, right? So there's the stereotype that white men are the saviors, and all our media and movies, right? White male saviors, and, you know, the hero, et cetera, but that's not the reality for white workers, particularly white males, no more than it's a positive stereotype. Maybe, you know, it's not a negative stereotype like for Black workers where it's crime or theft or be fearful of. It's a negative stereotype, which is not the reality of most Black workers either, right? But it's a stereotype that's pushed to divide us apart. And so both of these sort of like extremes are racist stereotypes, right? It's just one that kind of has a positive edge to it. And lastly, I think, you know, when we think about why racism was codified in the first place, like why was it just like, oh no, we need to institutionalize this, right? It was because of multiracial unity and rebellions. It was because of like a fear of like working people fighting back. And so that's the fear, right, is us coming together. And so any ideology that kind of maintains this unity, like Ryan was saying, like all y'all are saying, is like, to me, it hurts our chances at real liberation, at real freedom. And anything less than that is definitely not a privilege to me.
All right, that was awesome. Thank you guys. I think that question was well answered. There were a couple of comments, and I wanted, Lukman, I'll try to get to yours in a minute, but I wanted to kind of go, because there was a grouping of comments and questions together that I wanted to sort of pull at that thread a little bit. There were comments about state violence, structural violence. I think that there's been people within the APHA who are trying to talk about this theme. The theme for this year's conference was violence, and talking about structural violence instead of just interpersonal violence, right? And so I think that, you know, there were some interesting points made at the beginning, but as part of state violence, people brought up colonialism and this current pandemic are sort of examples of state violence, and that people wanted to know, like, what are y'all doing about it? Like, what kind of work is being done? And I do think that, I know that all of you guys are doing really interesting work. And I think that sometimes those practical examples can be really useful. So I know we've talked about some of this a little bit, but I wanted to make some space for a little bit more discussion about that. So yeah, if anybody wants to start there, maybe I'll call on John.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I guess for me, I guess there's a laundry list of things, like, you know, I can dive into. I mean, I think part of it was a couple of years ago, there's an airport in Gary, Indiana, in the which kind of, it's the Gary Chicago airport, and it essentially serves as like the main airport that all people are deported from the Chicago area, right? And so I think, you know, for me and some comrades that are on this call now, it was getting involved in that struggle, right? And showing up, you know, trying to disrupt as much as we could, you know, at one point even getting on the tarmac, right? And trying to stop some of these deportations from happening. I think it looks like right now, in terms of state violence, a really good example of it is in the recent uprisings in the summer, a young man named Mohawk Johnson, who was defending other protesters at a protest from the police, is kind of just being railroaded right now with charges. He had a couple of charges in the beginning, and I think like last week they just added 7 more, and this is carried on for a couple of months now. So and I think it's, you know, being involved in that struggle, right? I think right now, you know, this is, you know, our Scottsboro, you know, type, you know, struggle. So I think it's, you know, being involved in those type of struggles. I think it's, you know, showing up when folks are getting evicted. We have comrades as well that were, so in Chicago. So I guess I'll also say this. I think the bosses are using this pandemic as an opportunity to go on the offensive, right? So here in Chicago, that's when they started trying to railroad this Obama Center through, right? Where the Obama Center coming to Chicago is just going to push out a lot of Black workers from the South Side. It's also like right now, a lot of companies that are dealing with demolition and pollution right now are just polluting the hell out of workers where mostly Latinx and undocumented folks live. And then, you know, also in the midst of a pandemic, right, we're getting ready to go on, we're getting ready to hit our second wave. And in the midst of this, the city of Chicago is in the process of closing 3 hospitals, right? So the bosses are definitely going the offensive. And right. And so, you know, right now we're involved in all of these struggles, right? So I think is, you know, I think, yeah, we have to be involved in these struggles. We can't support, you know, from our windows. We can't just post nice statuses about it. If we are able, right? Some of us aren't able, and I get that, but if we are able, you know, we definitely need to be out there fighting with folks.
I think where I am in this area, it's very interesting because we had a predominantly working class Black population. Those of us that are in the mass organization, that were in the party, also, you know, talk to people about the importance of this working class Black population to fight against this proposed immigration prison that was going to be built in the city. And you know, racism, right? Racism under capitalism, especially Black folks and Latin folks have been separated purposefully, right? Outside of these populations have been just had a whole lot of racism injected into these populations against each other. So they don't unite, so they don't fight back against their common enemy, which are absolutely the ruling class. But in terms of waging this fight, we were able to show that the threat is coming from the same place. The threat for this working class Black area, where generationally, right, have been suffering from financial abuses, direct abuses by the police, education abuses. It's the same source that's trying to build this immigration prison, which, by the way, nobody's under any delusions that it was just going to be a certain population of people that were going to end up in this prison. It's another reality. So what we did is we showed the racist intentions of this and how it was going to harm everybody. And we created a multiracial intergenerational fight back against this immigration prison. And we were able to win that. Right now we're in our respective mass organizations. Another issue is forcing, right, this particular city to put the working class people of this city in charge of investigating cops who violate people. With physical violence and economic violence, right? That's an ongoing thing. But all of these things are related. You know, we're fighting for the most radical reform in these organizations, and sometimes we end up even fighting for things that we know isn't enough, right? But it's the fight. It's the building relationships with people in these organizations, and it's participating in that fight that strengthens us. Right. And it gives us the opportunity to build relationships with other folks. So all of these needs that exist in these communities, we have to, as a party, we have to be in those fights. That's what we do. We're very much a part of those fights.
If I think I'm going to ask one more question and then we'll wrap up. I think those were really good answers, and I really love those examples. I think practical examples can be really inspiring and helpful to us who are trying to figure out what to do and what else to do. So thank you guys for that. The last question I want to ask about is there's been some chatter in the chat about this idea of intersectionality and how, and I think the practical meat of the question, which we got to with a little bit of chatting, was, you know, it seems like people agree that racism and sexism are beneficial to capitalism and can't be gotten rid of without getting rid of capitalism. But because those things are so powerfully ingrained in us now, will we be able to get rid of them after a revolution? How would that work? What would it look like? And what ideas do you guys have on that? So I think that's, if I'm not getting the question right, Luke Mont, I mean, I might have to get them to unmute you so you can ask it yourself, but I think that's what I'm getting at as the question. So I don't know who would like to take that first. Maybe Felipe, since we haven't heard from you in a minute.
Okay, I'll take a stab. I mean, I think we shouldn't pose it as after the revolution. How are we going to end it? I think it should be from this point onward, right? And in the context of class struggle, how are we going to do that? So I think a big part of that is, how does our party operate? How are we? I mean, just looking at this panel, you know, the club situation. Who's leading the party, right? We have women, Black workers, Latin workers, Indigenous workers, queer workers, right? Do we have folks who throughout all these various intersections still say, at the end of the day, we got to smash capitalism, right? Is that represented in our party? And are we fighting to have that kind of representation in our party, right? And how do we have discussions, right, where everybody's voice is essential, right? So thinking about democratic essentialism, right? And how it's not about, you know, who's the most, you know, the loudest or dominant or whatever, but we encourage everybody's opinion. We want key folks in leadership positions, et cetera. So I think in how we engage in the class struggle, you know, who's leading the fight back? How are we learning from each other, right? And as things intensify to class war someday, by organizing in the military and organizing on the job and organizing on campuses, right? All of these are going to be expressions of how we work together, right? How we work together and build. And that all should be reflections of anti-sexism and anti-racism and all the various kinds of, you know, intersections within our leadership and how we're fighting it amongst ourselves, so that when the time comes where we're able to seize power, you know, we'll have some degree of modeling, you know, how this should look in society, right? But of course, it's going to be how we raise our children. It's going to be, you know, it's going to be so much of it will be decided after the fact, right? It's, you know, how we continue to fight this. But I think, you know, it's multifaceted. It has to be integrated into the culture of our organization now, into the culture of how we fight back. And then of course, that will then, you know, lead to the kind of world we're going to build later on an international scale. And I think it's important, you know, look, we're in 26 countries currently, and it's one political party. It's not the Communist Party of Pakistan or the Communist Party of US and Communist Party this or that, and then we have a coalition. No, it's one actual party with one centralized leadership for all of these people on this various things. So again, I think the degree that our party composes, even on a very small scale, the kind of society we want to build, then I think that'll answer that question as we move forward.
Does anyone else want to chime in on the panel?
I'll just add in that sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I think just to sort of recap, anti-racist, anti-sexist organizing has to happen now. It is hard because we do live in this racist, sexist society. So we're just ingrained with these norms, with these values. We live in segregated spaces. So you can't just expect people to just like hop on the anti-racist train if they've never been there before. So the work has to start now. And in my opinion, we won't get to any real mass action until there's multiracial unity, until we have eradicated racism and sexism in large swaths of society.
And I was actually just going to say purposefully, you know, we have to do that. We have to do it purposefully. We have to, you know, recognize that we're building upon our line as we go. We're having these experiences, as the comrade said, we're doing this now, right? We're in the practice of doing it now, and we are very purposeful about it. And that's knowing our line, and that's having confidence in our line. So.
Well, I think that we are getting really to the end of our time here. So I want to hand it back over to the moderator to close us out. And I was really honored to be able to moderate the chat and ask these questions of you guys. You're amazing.
Thank you, Carol. You did a great job, as did all the panelists. And to all of you who attended today, we hope that you will consider joining us in the long term to learn more about PLP and to participate in struggles with us. We know we live in a society that teaches us racism and sexism, cynicism, anti-communism, and to depend on liberals and elections to solve our problems. But I think what we've tried to show you is that we believe that another better world is possible no matter how much we are taught that it isn't. We are not just materialist, individualist beings that capitalism would have us believe, but we know from our experience in organizing together that what means the most to us are communal actions that we take in conjunction with our families, our friends, and our comrades toward the cause of a better world for everybody. So we hope you will become involved in local struggles. We have many discussion groups all over the country, and one advantage of this pandemic is that those groups are no longer limited by geography. So I think in the chat, you will find a reference to a longer document that gives contact information. We have a website, plp.org, at which you can read many of our documents and also subscribe to our newspaper, Challenge Desafío. So if you're already involved in a struggle or a discussion group, invite your friends. And we thank you all for coming. And we hope to see more of you in the future.
Thank y'all.
Thank you.